Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Chris Endrey Podcast. I'm your host. That's right, Chris Endrey. Could you believe it? Today, we're going to be looking at democracy in the context of the Australian election that's just happening. The reason I thought it was a good window, I'm generally not interested in talking about politics too much because I don't think it's where the center of our lives is or should be. But it's a really interesting phenomenon where this election is particularly boring and uninspired, which is happening at a time when there's so much going on in society, in international politics, in the economy. There's so many problems that could be solved by politics, and yet at the same time, we have kind of very bland and marginal representation occurring. And the discourse is also very bland and marginal, which I'll go into a little bit. So I wanted to look at why that might be the case. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing that that's what's happening at the political level, but it is for sure an interesting thing. And I think by scratching through it a bit, there's a lot that we can learn about what is our democracy in Australia versus what we perceive it to be. What is democracy generally? And maybe it's a nice window for reflection for what are some of the things that we can be caring about and looking at in our own lives and have an eye to in the future. So as I mentioned, I want to be talking about democracy today. And the first thing I thought would be worth discussing is that in many ways we don't have democracy at all. Like we vote for representatives and they congregate on a hill and make decisions on our behalf. But I don't think that most of us would feel that we are represented by these people. And that's not just because over time, the same type of person wants to go into politics. And so you end up with a class of types of people that are very good at operating in a particular way and getting to those spots, but not necessarily good at being concerned about what the people that they ostensibly represent want. It's not just that, but also, we live in a time now where we could very easily have much more participation in our democratic institutions than we do have. We get a little window every few years to vote. And I don't downplay the utility of that, but these are systems that were designed over a century ago, and they were designed for the technology and the societies that they had in the day. But now we have the capacity to access information at a totally different scale to the point that it's a problem how much information you can access. And we also have the capacity to connect with each other at an entirely different scale to when these systems were designed. I mean, it's not beyond imagination that we could all directly vote in any bill that's put before Parliament. We could draft them ourselves and send them. There's no obstacles. There's no physical obstacles to that sort of stuff happening, and yet it doesn't. And there are very good reasons, I guess, why you don't want most people voting on most issues, is because you need to have a threshold level of knowledge to participate. But that doesn't stop our representatives. That's not a requirement that's put on our representatives at all. Their only requirement is to get elected. And also, there are some issues that never even come up for voting that you would assume that we would be consulted on. But even our representatives aren't consulted on. Not to give away a spoiler, but things like, when we go to war or how we structure our electoral systems themselves, they don't even come up as issues, but they're potentially and very often the most important issues in our whole society. So it's fair to say that we have a situation where we could have a much more engaging democracy, and we don't. Not only do we not have it, but we barely even seem to pursue it. And that is a problem for some things. It would be a problem to have everybody voting on whether we need some certain seatbelt regulation or whatever that people might not know enough about to determine. But when it comes to other questions, like, say, for example, income tax levels or something, whatever it might be, it would be very easy to push out to everybody an opportunity to vote yes or no on any particular bill. But we don't pursue that. And it's a problem because it creates a gap because of the type of people that end up in politics. Because through the systemic incentives of our democracy, we have created a political class where it's broadly impossible for them to take a lot of issues that are very important seriously. Often they don't even register at all. This is because our politicians are likely only in for a few years. So it's very hard for them to care about long-term issues. Not only are they only in there for a short time, but they're held to account every few years with an election, which makes it basically impossible for them to pursue any of the very many good ideas that can cause short-term pain. So like massive investments in infrastructure, restructuring of society to change tax incentives that hurts people in the short term. I remember Paul Howes, that creepy guy from one of the big unions, he, during the carbon tax debate, he said that he wouldn't back a carbon price if it meant the loss of a single job. And you almost can't do anything to your society without having an impact of a single job. He represented a significant percentage of political power in the country at that time. And so it's sort of these short-term incentives. It's sort of famous to talk about, but it is really important that we're sort of stuck on being able to do the long-term investment that certain things in society require. And this plays out in issue after issue. You could see our failure to get a very fast train going, our failure to get even just rail corridors for commercial freight, our failure to build out proper internet, which is it's astonishing. You would think that building out a proper internet service would be a unanimous and obvious good, but even still, we've been unable to do that. Failure to have good public transport within our cities. It's the same story across issue after issue, and it all comes down to the short-term incentives of the political class. Also, very few of our politicians are in portfolios that they dreamed of as being the peak of their career. They're very often in stepping stone things, so they may not be, they may be not expert on the topic, but they may be not even interested in the topic that they are responsible for, the portfolio area, which is frustrating because it means that we don't get the best people in the best jobs. There's probably 10,000 people that would be better equipped to be generating and leading decision making on any number of the topics, health, finance, whatever it might be, than the person who ends up as the minister with portfolio responsibility for that, and that leads to suboptimal outcomes that you can also see everywhere. Also, our politicians are almost all dependent upon the donor classes and the lobby groups of incumbent power. Now, this is one that's cliche to complain about, so maybe you tune out even just to hear those words. But it's really worth taking the time to think about what that really means, because not only just do you have the tipping of the scales against the best outcomes, say, for example, the car manufacturing lobby, which doesn't exist anymore because we don't manufacture cars, but if we did, they would agitate for more investments in their existing ways of manufacturing cars, and that outcompetes the growth of an industry that isn't there yet, that might replace it, which is actually what's happened in the example of the car lobby, because they successfully got subsidies for years, were dependent upon those subsidies to continue manufacturing. They weren't incentivized to change what they manufactured, and bada bing, bada boom, when the political winds shift and they're no longer getting those subsidies, they can't compete at all. And now we have zero car manufacturing and don't have the capacity to manufacture cars to the complexity of the market requirements in the era of electric vehicles. And it's a lose-lose-lose. And that type of situation emerges continuously across every sphere of society you can think of, because the most powerful players in a particular arena have the capacity to fund parties and to have their voice disproportionately represented. So that's a loss in all directions, except for the people that make money from it at the time, and except for the politicians that get to retain their power. So who are obviously the main players in these social games, but against the general principle of what democratic society should be, which is to represent the interests of people themselves. Even more than just tipping the scales, though, like that with lobbying groups, it also means that the organizations that are established get to massively outcompete those that might replace them. I gave the example of commercial rail earlier. Like, we're not going to have big projects to build rail and replace trucking, because trucking is a big constituent. There's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of people employed by it. And so they'll be very loud and annoying to replace, even though that might be in the interest of everybody to do so. So you've got some immediate, obvious baseline problems in the system that you have, which is the political cycles are short, so they're not incentivized for people to make decisions that are in the interest of the long-term future of everybody, which is how you want to live an ideal life anyway. You don't have the best ideas going forward because of the disproportionate representation of donors and lobby groups, and just the bias towards incumbency. And you don't have politicians in the realms that they care about the most, and you don't get the best people going into politics. That's another topic. I don't want to talk about it today, but that's a catastrophic one. And you don't have the actual genuine movement towards the principles of the democracy, which is to represent people's interest by consulting them, which is ostensibly what it all exists for. But there's the revealed preference is that none of the technologies that could move us towards that are being picked up at all. So what does this look like in reality? It means that we get a discourse where the topics that are talked about are actually just in the margins between the two major parties that sort of drives most of the discourse. And those topics, sometimes they are the things that are most important. Obviously, it's very, very hard not to talk about a huge fire if that's happening, or it's very hard not to talk about housing if everybody's suffering from it. But even when the topics themselves that are most important are discussed, we're talking about them often in the most marginal sense, with very little room for genuine ambition or huge risk taking. And again, that's a product of them having to put up their hand for judgment every few years. It does encourage a sort of passivity and a bias away from action, which in some things is great, but in many of the problems that we face at the moment because of this situation is a catastrophe. So I want to go through different areas of what we talk about in politics, in Australian politics, how we talk about them, and some of the issues that we don't talk about at all, just to illustrate how significant this problem actually is. And I don't say this is a problem just because it's fun to complain. It's a problem of a huge opportunity cost. We have an extremely rich country. We have incredible resources, total great position for safety, a very intelligent, educated populace. We live in a time of godlike tools, and to waste the advantage of those opportunities is criminal, and not just in the idea that we should be producing and generating more wealth above everything else, but the intelligence tools that we have to build society in a way that is satisfying and rewarding for all the participants. Because in addition to the sort of greyness and blandness of this current election, I think there's a general sense that things are getting worse, which is kind of crazy because of the unprecedented historic wealth that we sit on and the opportunities attached to that. So I alluded to it earlier, but the first one I want to talk about, because it's the one I always want to talk about, is housing policy. It's been obvious for decades now that Australia has a total catastrophic housing trend, which is a concentration of housing into fewer and fewer people, and the inaccessibility of housing for people who want to enter the housing market for themselves. And the reason this is a catastrophe is not just because of some sort of communist ideal that everybody should own a house. I don't think that's the case, and I don't think it would be rewarding if that were the case. It's also not the case of like just a generational war where the boomers own so much stuff and young people need to be able to get their foot on the ladder. You know, that's also true, but that's really trivializing the extent of what the actual catastrophe is. The catastrophe is that without people having baseline security to pursue life as they wish in their society, all the higher functions get lost. And it's a problem that is a bit under the rug at the moment because it's a minority of people still that can't enter the housing market. It's a growing number, obviously, but it's still a minority. Most people in Australia own their own houses. But as that keeps declining, it's going to roll exponentially the consequences of what it means for people who are not able to afford their own house. Because there are so many second order things that you have in your life that come from having housing security. And those things are in many ways the bedrock of all of society. I can't state it strongly enough. Anyone who's been following me knows I've been harping on about this for almost a decade now. And it's not just because I would like to own a house. It's because if you have a teacher that doesn't own the house, that can't afford to own a house, and they're traveling an hour to get to the school that they work in, the school they work in isn't in the society that they live in, isn't in the community that they care about. They've got their own personal stresses, so they're not turning up to their life in the same way. That teacher is not a fungible commodity with a teacher that lives next door to the school, is there for 3 decades, knows all the kids, sees them, their parents at the supermarket or whatever, and doesn't have to worry about their baseline security and just can care about teaching. Those are not fungible units. Okay, they're both teachers. One looks the same on a piece of paper. It's entirely different. And you can do that for basically every profession. And not just professions, but also the lifestyles that that are not career oriented, but are still really important to society. As housing becomes more expensive, people can't choose to do things like volunteer in their local community. They can't choose to be a carer for their parents or care for their children. This is a sort of famous example at the moment. People can't afford to have time with their children in the critical years that they want to, which is insane, because our society's become so much richer and it's thrown so much out the door on the way. So housing is a catastrophe, and yet our political class and discourse will trot out the words that we have a housing crisis and then say, here's a few $1 billion. We're going to give people 20 grand so they can help buy their first house in a city where the average house is $1 million. Or, and of course, the market goes up by 20 grand because every new entrant has that money. Or, we're going to construct some new houses and there'll be a couple 100,000 more houses in the market in 10 years. These are all just pissing around at the moment. It's absolute frittering nonsense. And not only that, it does the disservice of not talking about the problem in the terms of its severity, which is, in my mind, red alert and getting worse. This is across the world, the Western world in particular at the moment. But in Australia, it's even more embarrassing because our tax structures are all incentivized to radically gear up that problem continuously, and there's no serious plan to deal with it. And I can understand why. If you're a member of parliament. If you don't already own 10 houses yourself, which many of them do, I think the average parliamentarian is like 2 point something houses that they own because so many of them own so many. So there's your first incentive for not wanting to tank house prices, which is really what it's going to take to improve accessibility. The second incentive is most people own houses and will be very upset if you do anything that lowers or that stops the continuing increase of the value of that asset. And so you'll get elected out, which is why we have, we sort of get what we deserve with our systems here, and it's a disaster. It's an earthquake under all of society. It's only going to keep disintegrating, and the consequences will keep emerging. And yes, hopefully, someone at some point is able to address it. But it does seem like the type of thing where we're waiting for a catastrophe now, because the problem is not represented at all in the political class, despite the lip service that they pay to it. War and defense. This is really an important one to talk about, because we currently have a huge land war in Europe. We have a monstrous war on the people of Gaza in the Middle East, and Israel's occupied parts of Syria. And we have the spectre of war between Pakistan and India, with the conflict that's escalating there. And it seems like we're sort of held back by paper breadth from US war against Iran. And these are topics that are understandably distant from day-to-day lives of Australians, but given our history in being involved in every single war that America wants us to, they should be discussed. There should be a discourse here, because we have had a commensurate part for our small population with a lot of the violent upheavals of societies throughout the 20th century, led by the US empire, and we don't discuss it. The last I remember us really seriously engaging with it, there was the huge protests against the Iraq War, and we still went. And there's no discussion of how we involve ourselves in these things, or why, or at the political level. We just seem to have a sort of uni-party in that sense. Both parties are the same, and that's borne out in their defence policies, which are. I had a quick look. Both of them are looking at ramping up defence spending by 20 billion in the next few years. And beyond that, there's no real great specifics, which is really funny to me because the discussion is like, oh, how much are we going to spend on defense? How much are we going to spend on a couple bits of particular gear? Maybe it's so uninspired, because I mean, I could tell you now that I'm going out to dinner and I'm going to spend $30, but actually, no, I'm going to spend $50. But that doesn't tell you anything really, because I could go, I could buy 100 cheeseburgers. Not in the current market prices, but I could buy a huge platter of cheeseburgers, or I could buy one really fancy salmon steak or whatever. The point that I'm trying to make is that the amount of money that you spend on something doesn't indicate the quality or the return of what you're going to get on it. And so to say that we're just going to spend $20 billion or X percentage of GDP is a kind of nonsense thing. It doesn't attach to any outcome, but nobody seems to care, particularly in the realm of defense. They could spend tens of billions of dollars on, a few airplanes. The airplanes don't have to have any particular plan or be related at all to what we do. And they don't even have to function or be built yet. And they broadly get away with spending that money. It's obviously just the price that we pay to remain as a part of the American empire. But is there a discussion at the political level of whether we want to do that? I mean, I'm sure that there are, without looking it up, I'm sure that in smaller parties, they have strong policies on removing us from that sort of stuff. But let's be honest, that even with a balance of power, they're not going to be calling those shots. And it's embarrassing, I think, for the country to have no real discourse on some of the stuff that is the most important to us. And again, this goes to a crisis of democracy, because not only is there no discourse, it could be the most impactful thing that happens in our lives. Through my YouTube channel, Second Look, which is the video essays, I did a video on conscription relatively recently, and was shocked to think that I could be conscripted to go fight and kill and potentially die in a war that has nothing to do with me. And the war itself doesn't have to be declared by not even, not a referendum, God forbid we should be asked to that level, but not even an act of parliament. Not even the majority of the parliament has to be consulted to start a war. Not even the majority of the party in power has to be consulted to start a war. Just the cabinet themselves, or can just send us off to fight and die in Iran. Now, it's unlikely that's going to happen, but it did happen just 2 generations ago. I have relatives that are not here because of being conscripted to fight in Vietnam and then dying in their 20s. And that is a much more important thing in your life to happen than, say, income tax going down or up by a couple percent, or the bracket shifting or whatever. And these are the things that occupy so much of the discourse, but they're pale compared to the idea of losing your entire life, or even successfully living your life, but going and carrying the ghosts of killing others, or being involved in a war that you maybe know nothing about and don't care for. So war and defense generally are extraordinary features of our society, because they are potentially the most important thing that will happen in the life of a citizen, and they're not democratically expressed at all. I can understand the need for that. You can't necessarily consult everybody, because there's always, much as with specific regulations or whatever, there's always nuance and expertise required to navigate this, and we do have to outsource the handling of it to others. But I think the balance is wrong, and it's almost cynical how poor our structures are for consulting and understanding, or even communicating and discussing why we might be involved in sending weapons, sending troops, sending money for weapons, just being involved at all in many of the real and awful conflicts that are ruining lives across the planet at the moment. Moving on from war to another one of Australia's addictions, is addiction generally. Gambling is something that we do in Australia that it's surprising how normalized it is to how outlier we are. I think most people don't realize that New South Wales alone has like a quarter of the world's pokies. In fact, I'm going to look that up. New South Wales percentage world pokies. Oh my God. Yeah. Okay. So New South Wales has 0.15% of the world's populations. It has 37% of the world's poker machines that are not located in casinos. There's one poker machine for every 88 people. That is not a normal situation, obviously. We lose the most per capita, not just on pokies, but gambling generally, by a mile, because our laws are much laxer than even places that we think of as Wild West libertarian paradises like the US. I think they're trying to get the types of sports gambling and advertising regulations that we have in Australia. Why is this a problem? Well, I mean, it's certainly not a problem to have fun doing something and to I feel like consenting adults can navigate that stuff, but you do need to have some safety rails around it, because kids don't have their brains aren't developed. They can't make decisions in the same way as adults can, but also adults are capable of, we've all seen it, adults are capable of making decisions that will ruin their lives. And we see that again and again with gambling. Do you have the right to ruin your life? Absolutely. You can ruin it in any number of ways, and you don't want to baby people out of being able to live their lives. But where you have an understanding where there are certain people that are susceptible to types of things, we do put up a bit of a guardrail. We don't just sort of suggest don't drink and drive. We make it illegal. Like if you like drinking, you also can't do that anywhere, and you can't do it from any age, and whatever. The point, it's you don't need to have too much creative imagination to see how there's regulations around any number of things that are dangerous. Driving itself, we have seatbelts and they're mandatory, and I think most people think that's a good idea. There are safety requirements to even be able to put a car on the road. I think most people think that's a good idea. In the same way, being able to have poker machines that can take huge amounts of your money in very short periods of time. We know that some people are really susceptible to that. It's a very small percentage of people that are giving the most money to these machines, and it ruins their lives. And the conversation that we have around that is, frankly, pathetic. Like it's so small. I'll talk a bit more about this when I talk about hung parliaments, but that's the last time it was even seriously discussed that I remember was Andrew Wilkie tore up the parliamentary agreement because in a hung parliament he tried to get some small limits to gambling, and then there was a incumbency lobbying campaign saying who voted for the license to punt, and it was deemed too politically hot by Julia Gillard, and so she reneged on their commitment to regulate them. And so we're in this Wild West now, and it's not just a disaster for the people who lose that money. It's kind of boring because there's so much money in that stuff that it supplants other things in our society. So, if you've ever gone to a pub in Sydney or Melbourne in the last 20 years, if you're old enough to have gone for the preceding 20 years, you would see that instead of a band being in the corner, or instead of someone entertaining doing something, they could just put a few of the machines and rely on some people to pour their income through that instead of having to actually do anything interesting. And aside from being shithouse for the people that lose all that money, it's shithouse for everybody who ends up with a boring public sphere. And this is actually my lamentation. You go across the whole coast of New South Wales, some of the most physically beautiful places in the world. There's kind of very little to do in so many of them because there's just an RSL that dominates everything. They're able to take all the money that they get from pokies and pretend that they do other things. And it's really insidious now. They'll do like childcare, or they'll, have cheap steaks or whatever, all these things. But it's all just to feed and funnel people into the grinder, and it's boring, which is maybe the greatest crime of it. But we don't talk about that. And the only policies coming about gambling in this federal election are nothing from Labor. Big surprise. They're totally in bed with the gambling industry and directly own machines through the ACT. And from the Liberal Party, they've, to their credit, they've said they're going to ban gambling advertising during, before, and after sports matches, which is... That's really something. That's not nothing, but it is still frittering around the margins because our big sports leagues have gambling partners. And advertising all over the grounds, advertising, it's an embedded part of the coverage now. That's the thing they're trying to weed out. But it's just such a normalized culture. And again, I'm a pretty sort of classical liberal type in that to each their own, etc. But where you have people who can't make decisions for themselves being exposed to the normalized behavior of just donating your money to systems that are designed to steal it from you. Not great. Not great. And as mentioned, boring. Speaking of boring, another feature that I keep whining about in these podcasts is smartphone and tech addiction. I think that that's a fascinating feature of modern life. Has its pluses, has its minuses, both are significant, but broadly undiscussed in the public discourse. That Labor's banning, I think, social media for people under 16 or something like that. But that seems like a type of thing that will be very easy to get around and very difficult to enforce. And again, it's frittering at the margins. You know, we're dealing with a catastrophic in terms of its impact, the rewiring of human cognition, capacity, and focus. And there's no real discourse around that. I don't really necessarily think it's the place of government to make decisions on our behalf in this realm either. I feel like it's something that can exist in society, and we can navigate ourselves. But I do think it's interesting that something so big and sweeping that has, you know, visible effects on things like birth rates or the rates of people having sex or suicides. Like it kind of touches all elements of the extremes of lives, and there's virtually no discourse on what the big ideas are in how we manage that and navigate that coming from the political class, which is noteworthy, if nothing else. And on exactly that, on the opportunities of the moment, we're in the AI revolution. You know, there's cryptocurrency is a potential massive path for future transactions and wealth management. Robotics can revolutionize how the workforce exists and how labor is conducted at all. We're in the middle and the precipice of these phenomenal changes to what human society will be, and there's kind of nothing. We're kind of crickets from the people who are the people who are the prime minister or want to be the prime minister of an entire continent. You kind of hear nothing about these most important things, and I get the sense that that's because they don't understand them and because they don't need to talk about them. But you know, it would be nice if it was part of the vision of what society is going to look at. Like, I mean, I have a friend, I can't identify them, extremely brilliant person at the cutting edge of AI, and is preparing to phase themselves out of work in the next 2 years. They say within the next 2 years, everything that they can do will be completely overtaken and they'll be pointless, and they're going to, you know, look up how to just hang out in nature more. That's their plan, and they're not sure what they'll do for money. Maybe become a tradie until that stuff is overtaken by robotics as well. So, you know, these are if you were to think about the difference between what the landscape of human society looked like in, let's say, you know, 500 AD, the Amazon, and 1850 Manchester, these are like, we're going to experience that kind of shift again, but across a planetary scale and in shorter time. Like, it's going to be within our lifetimes, as a small blip within our lifetime. So these are the types of things that you would expect the political class to be discussing and to have a plan for. Even a vague one, even a vague outline of saying, well, look, as people's jobs are redundant, or as, you know, as we're farming off more and more of our money to a small group of companies in, you know, a couple postcodes in the US, here's our plan for how we're going to get money from the value that we're shipping off, or here's our plan for how we're going to help the people that don't profit from this, or here's our plan, whatever, anything. Instead, there's nothing, which is, I think, can only be read as a failure of democracy, because it's not just the case in our society, but in others as well. But it's kind of astonishing to think about. At least I hope you find it astonishing, because otherwise my podcast will lose its listenership. Thanks, by the way, for listening. Um, attached to that, attached to these upheavals and tech and smartphone addiction and all those sorts of things. Mental health. You always hear about mental health being in a crisis, and political leaders like to say this, and they like to capitalize on being seen to do things with this. But again, it's the same thing. It's just frittering with the margins. Their plans are to spend a billion here, billion there on for I think the Labor. They want to build walk-in centres. For the coalition, they want to fund more psych sessions. But these are not how you solve problems. If you find out that everyone in your town is their hair's falling out, you don't. The solution is not to like, oh, we'll have a couple shops that give you discount wigs on the corner. No, your solution is to figure out why everyone's hair is falling out and to hopefully stop it. And that is not. It's okay. It's beyond the capacity of government alone to navigate, but it sure is within their remit to care about and to discuss. And that is another huge failure of imagination. I handed out how to votes a decade ago or something, and I stood next to this guy who was doing the same, and he was a health economist at the University of Canberra, and it's stuck with me ever since. I asked him what the biggest problem that he saw in health in the ACT where I lived was, and he said that everything is around announceables. Nothing is around substance. Everything is around announceables. Where it's maybe in the interest to get everybody to go for a jog or something, or to have some communication programs or things like that. Instead of saying that, they like to say we're going to have 200 new hospital beds and 300 more nurses or whatever, and it's the same across everything. If law and order is the problem, okay, well, we need more police and jails and that sort of stuff. We don't need to have better literacy for 2-year-olds or whatever it might be that has a strong correlation and a cheaper dollar to return impact. Yes, the focus is always on just good enhanceables, and that is a failure of democracy. Also, a really obvious one to talk about is resources extraction. We do a terrible, like a shameful job of how we tax the resource extraction that occurs in our country, particularly embarrassing because it's not even Australian companies that are doing the extraction most of the time. I mean, BHP and Rio Tinto are massively majority foreign owned as shareholders, and they're reaping enormous dividends from the extraction of resources that allegedly you and I and other Australian citizens own, but that profit has gone up and up and up and up, but the tax taken from the extraction has remained relatively stagnant. And this sort of unique wealth opportunity has been completely pissed down the wind. You talk about the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund and things like that. That's the type of thing that we had the opportunity to introduce here, and yet we've failed to do that. Other extraction heavy countries have enormous social windfalls from this, like they will have no income tax or something like that. We don't have any such benefits, and any attempt that we do to tinker with it is met with fierce campaigning. And I mean, the attempts don't even seem to come up anymore because it feels very much like a case of the same team. A lot of the parliamentarians will be on the boards of these companies after their retirement, or they'll be on the boards of these companies before they even run for MPs in some case. So that is a catastrophe that doesn't represent the interests of Australian people, and not enough actors in our society talking about it. So one of the things that people hope for in this is to have a hung parliament, because then you've got the two major parties in minority and they need to navigate with it'll be the Teals, I guess, or some other mix of whatever independents end up in. And this is for sure good for some things, but I think that there's too much hope placed in the idea that controlling the balance of power is a game changer. It can be, but there's no reason that it necessarily is. And I think this is because we spend so much time in the sort of gamesmanship of it that we think that if say David Pocock in the Senate controls the balance of power and gets to determine every bill that goes through, because the Labor Party are in power and they need him to get something up, that misses the fact that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party representing incumbent power are basically aligned on most of the foundational uh, precepts of our society. And so while say, for example, Dave might not want a conscription bill to pass or something like that, okay, Labor would need him to get it to pass independently, but the Labor and Liberal can easily team up and ensure that that our gas deal is safe, or, our extraction is never taxed, or whatever it might be. So it's not the panacea that we could hope for. Separate to that, anything truly radical that happens also has a history of being knocked back. I guess most famously seen with Gough Whitlam, where he had a bunch of radical social spending policies, but also in particular, he wanted to pull out from the US alliance and to, I think, kick out their bases in because there are 3 US bases in Australia at least. Pine Gap. I wouldn't even know the names of all of them. How sad is that? Anyway, he wanted to withdraw from that alliance and do various other things, and he was promptly kicked out of power. The same was true when Kevin Rudd tried to tax the revenue from resources extraction. He wanted to introduce the type of tax that you see in many other countries, but was immediately kicked out. And so it's hard to think that is where salvation lies. Which brings me to the ultimate point in this, which is we don't talk about democracy itself. We don't talk about, there's no conversation on how to improve representation. There's no conversation. I mean, at the outlier level, the parties of the left talk a little bit about extending the vote to 16-year-olds and older. I have a friend that mounted the case once to me that everybody should get a vote, including babies. And I think that there's a merit in that, absolutely, and it's worth discussing. But it's another conversation that's just invisible from the radar, and it's so important, because if we claim to value the robustness of our society by the virtue of giving everybody a voice and being able to represent that perspective within it, then surely we would be doing all that we want to, all that we can, to make sure that there is actual representation and expression of people's interests and voices and a discourse and a dialogue. But that seems to be a distant fantasy, because you never hear anybody talk about it. The most I can think about is Tim Ferguson, if you know him, was running as a party called, I think, Direct Democracy Party, or no, Senator Elect or something like that, where he had a commitment to do whatever his constituents told him. So I guess it would be like a website, and you're like, here's this bill. How do you want me to vote? I'll vote like this. Why isn't that the norm? Why isn't that the absolute baseline requirement to be a representative, or at least to then explain when you don't follow things? I live in Hungary, which is maligned for good reason for its current state of politics. But even here, currently, we have a referendum. It's not a referendum. We have a national poll where everybody has the opportunity to say whether or not they think the Ukraine should join the European Union. It's just a yes or a no. And even though that's not binding, it's the type of thing that could easily be done on any number of topics that are important, because it gives the pressure upon the political class to, if they go against what the prevailing preference of the public is, they have to at least explain why that might be the case. Instead, currently, the questions aren't even asked, and just the conduct is undertaken. And if that is something that continuously goes against the will of people, then you suffer all these consequences, like political disengagement, low quality personnel, and all these things that I think are things that you frankly see. Just quickly, while we're talking about a referendum, the voice referendum is another fantastic example of this, because there was a big breach. We tried to talk about, do we want to have Indigenous recognition in the Constitution in a specific way? It failed, and now, like, what happened to that conversation? It's off. It's gone. Indigenous disadvantage is clearly one of the defining catastrophes of contemporary Australian existence. Though it doesn't touch most people, those who it does touched in the extreme, and it's a problem that by all measurements is getting worse rather than better. The conversation around that is largely sidelined because it's complex, and we don't get the very basic outcomes that would be representative of the society. Because I think most people would very happily have some lines in the Constitution saying, you know, when Australia was founded, there were Indigenous peoples here across the continent, and it's their country too, and we hope to share it. It's so simple. Almost everybody would agree with that, and yet we can't manage to get it together to put it in, which is a failure of the political class. A couple more topics before we look at the outcome of this election itself. The environment is an astonishingly poisoned discourse, I'm afraid to say. It's as poisoned as the environment itself. We are incapable of having a good conversation about it. It's become an ideological game where if the feeling of the sort of further right you are, the more dismissive you are of the caring for the environment, and the converse on the left, which is ridiculous, given that we are all dependent upon it, and we are all responsible for its stewardship. There's no conversation again around the things that actually matter in this. There's frittering at the margins, and even when it was at the front and center, and we were talking about carbon pricing and emissions and things like that, which have seemingly gone out of fashion to discuss, we weren't talking about those in honest terms, because there was this huge emotional contest around, are we going to reduce our emissions by 5% across a certain period or what have you, and the mechanisms to achieve that. But of course, that immediately undermines itself, because Australia, even though we contribute a huge amount for a small country, I think it's 2% of global emissions or something like that, raising that by 5% is not going to change anything. And we need to talk seriously about what are our plans for a future in which there's more carbon in the atmosphere, and you can have any discussions around the margins of what we can know and cannot know about that, but the discourse has been very poor. I hope you agree. And we also don't talk about the major, from my perspective, the major catastrophe of contemporary environmental stuff, which is our high rates of consumption of stuff that we don't need to be consuming, and products that didn't exist at all on the planet, like types of products like certain plastics and chemical compounds and what have you, that were just, they didn't even exist a century ago, and now we're increasingly at an exponentially increasing rate putting them everywhere. There's no discourse around that. There's no plan. There's just embarrassing things that happen now and then, like Victoria said, it came out they were sending all their recycling to China, and then China said we're not going to take it anymore. Like there's just all these like weird systems that are very catch-22. The book, not the phenomenon, in their execution, and in this election that's manifested in a really boring way, with sort of a discussion around environment, that means energy. Here's our plan for, we want to have X mix of renewable energy, we want to have nuclear power plants, etc., etc. Of course, those are important parts of the conversation, but in isolation they actually mean nothing. You could put in enough energy in Australia tomorrow, it was all nuclear, that would cover 100% of our needs. Does that mean that we're going to get rid of the coal and gas plants that we have as well, or are we going to be delighted to have extra stuff to export? Probably the latter. Certainly, if there's not a framework of reducing your overall usage of such resources. It's Jevons paradox in engineering, and it just comes up time and time again how few politicians seem to be aware of that. Are very happy to trumpet something that sounds like a win, and I guess it's our fault, because most of us think that it is a win to have increased access to renewable electricity or something like that. Sounds great, but if that just means that you're burning less coal here, you're shipping it off to Indonesia to be burnt, it doesn't actually solve the problem. It's just pushing the balloon around, and will come with all the consequences that we fear. And that's a disaster. The other one is immigration. Immigration, we don't have a nuanced discourse around at all. You can understand why, but it's been something for my entire life that I can remember. It's been a toxic topic. It was when I was younger, it was the conversation with John Howard and boat people, and there was all this sort of obsession around asylum seekers and how they come here, and breaking the rules, and then the anger at how we treat those people by putting them in extrajudicial prisons offshore, etc., etc. And because these extreme elements of the reality dominated the conversation, there's instead been no real conversation around what is an optimal rate of immigration, because it's sort of a fig leaf. It's like, okay, we'll yell and scream about 4,000 people, and rightly so. Like, if you're really if that's your concern of values, these are important topics, but it supplants the discourse around, well, okay, if we've got 150,000 people coming in a year, what are we doing? What's the plan? Like, is it just that we're going to continuously build out our cities and then assume that infrastructure will follow? Is it that we're going to assume that there'll be enough housing and that, or that there'll be enough expertise, or whatever it might be? It's an impactful phenomenon, regardless of your whatever side of the aisle you sit about it. And there's no discourse that reflects the actual nature of the impact. The discourse relates to sort of the feeling of like, oh, I don't like being swamped with immigrants, or oh, I actually really like people from all cultures and we should have as much immigration as we want. And those feelings dominate the conversation, which is so frustrating, because it is something that is actually warranting an intelligent and a non-ideological and non-heated discourse, because it's extraordinarily impactful. Our population wouldn't be growing if it wasn't for immigrants. Now, that in its own is a huge conversation to have that you just don't hear from the political class at all. So there's all these topics where we don't hear from the political class and we don't see ourselves represented in them. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's in a lot of matters, it's a good thing. I don't want a political class that determines how I have friendships, or what type of work I want to do, and all of these things. But I think it's pretty clear from the topics that we did talk about that they do talk about this sort of contested small margin between the centre, and it masquerades as a discourse around those topics when there is often a much larger and more important and often urgent conversation to be had. And so this is generally, I think, a catastrophic failure, and it's hard to know what to do with it as a citizen, because the good news is most of the things that affect your life the most are at arm's distance. It's very far away. No matter who wins this election, most of the things that are the most meaningful to you, you wouldn't see a change to them in the most useful way. And that's because I think that's because most of the important things to most of us are our intimate relationships and how we spend our day-to-day lives. And yes, okay, they can be altered by government changes and things like that, but they can't stop your best friend being your best friend, or what have you. And those are things that you could work on separately, improving separately to any of this political discourse. Where it becomes a problem is these big questions. They represent forces that are sweeping across us regardless. And if we don't have the capacity to deal with them, then they will sweep us in directions that we have no control over. And it's false to think that in many of these questions we do have no control over them. We're just not exercising, or we're just not capable of getting together and facing them all at once. And I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing ultimately that it is such a boring election period. Maybe it's good because it reflects that there are a few contested things and we do generally have an idea where we're facing as a nation, but I don't think that's the case. I think what's happening is our discourse has wandered so far off the reservation from our actual problems that when catastrophes and crises hit, we won't have the capacity to deal with them. We won't be facing the same direction. We're not seeing anything off at the pass. We're not preventing the obvious things from hitting us that will hit us. And that will result in more needless pain of adjustment as they come, whether it is hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs, whether it is communities being completely hollowed out and not being able to connect to each other, and the individual consequences of that, of feeling isolated, alone, suffering. I think that those things are going to hit from any number of the topics that were discussed, and hopefully it's not some of the worst examples of being conscripted to fight to defend Taiwan against your will, or civil war, or any of the things that we assume will never hit us but have hit societies consistently throughout history. Hopefully it's none of those, but I hope that from this exploration you can have your own interrogation of what these matters might mean in your own life, and if you do think that it's an interesting way of looking across the type of the problem, and it's been and it's brought up anything for you that you think was useful, I would love it if you would share this with a friend, even just a snippet, because I love having this space to chat to you and to chat to other people. We're going to continue chatting with other people throughout the podcast in the coming weeks. This was just a little detour with just me. Thanks for joining me, and thanks so much, especially to the most attractive people on the planet, my patrons, who are not only attractive, but they're intelligent, they're graceful, they have a wisdom that I can only hope to emulate as I mature. If you wish to become one of these valuable people, you can go over to patreon.com/Endrey and sign up. You can do it for as little as the cost of something like a loaf of sourdough a month, but even cheaper, because sourdough is getting a bit pricey. All right, I'll see you next time.